Good day. I'm going to talk today about Chapter 10, Triumph and Travails of the Jeffersonian Republic. One of the first lessons that Jefferson and his followers realized after their victory in 1800 that it was much easier to condemn out of office than it was to govern consistently when in office. During the election of 1800, one of the greatest problems that John Adams and the Federalists faced in the election was Adams' refusal to take the country to war against France. In the election of 1800, the Federalists accused Thomas Jefferson of having robbed a widow, having fathered numerous mulatto children by his own slave woman, Sally Hemings, of being an atheist, and having robbed children of their trust funds. In the 1800 election, Jefferson won the state of New York because Aaron Burr used his influence to turn the state to Jefferson. During the campaign, Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans presented themselves as strict constructionists, protectors of agrarian purity, believers of political and economic liberty, and strong supporters of states' rights. Because there was a tie in the Electoral College in the election of 1800, we will have the election go to the House of Representatives as dictated by the Constitution. What happens is that he will win the popular electoral vote because there were many Federalists who would rather have Jefferson than Aaron Burr, so they will basically have Federalists refrain from voting. This will not happen again because the 12th Amendment will be passed by Congress and ratified by the required number of states, so that now electors have two votes, one for a presidential candidate and one for a vice presidential candidate. So Thomas Jefferson was elected president by the House of Representatives only when a few Federalists refrained from voting. Jefferson saw his election and his mission as president to return to the original spirit of the Revolution, restore the Republican experiment, check the growth of the Republican experiment, and halt the decay of virtue. As to Jefferson's relation with his slave Sally Hemings, rumors that Jefferson fathered her mulatto children were used by his political opponents to discredit him in the 1800 presidential election, even though Jefferson consistently denied having a sexual relationship with her throughout his life. As late as the 1870s, one of Sally's children claimed that his mother identified Jefferson as the father of her 5 children, and in the late 20th century, DNA evidence showed a high probability that Jefferson fathered Sally's youngest son. But with Jefferson's election as president, the Democratic Republican Party grew less unified as the Federalist Party began to fade and lose power. The Federalist Party died out due in part to its inability to identify with the common people. 2 laws that Jefferson repealed were the 14-year naturalization requirement under the Alien Act and the excise tax on whiskey. But Jefferson and his Treasury Secretary Albert Gallatin, kept most Federalist financial policies in place, such as funding assumption and the Bank of the United States. So Jefferson's presidency was characterized by his moderation in the administration of public policy. When it came to the major Federalist economic programs, Jefferson as president left practically all of them intact. Jefferson and his followers opposed John Adams' last-minute appointment called midnight judges of new federal judges, mainly because the appointments were an attempt by the defeated party to entrench itself in the judicial branch of government, because judgeships were for life. At the end of John Adams' term, he basically will nominate and Congress will approve the selection of John Marshall as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And John Marshall did more than probably even Alexander Hamilton to ensure a powerful central government in the American political and economic system. Much of this was due to his experience during the American Revolution, because before he became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall's service at Valley Forge during the American Revolution convinced him of the drawbacks of a feeble central government and authority. The legal precedent for judicial review established by John Marshall was established when the Judiciary Act of 1789 was declared constitutional. In the case of Marbury versus Madison, Marbury will basically be denied his appointment as the Justice of the Peace of Washington by Madison, the new incoming Secretary of State, and he will sue in court. And basically, with this Marbury versus Madison, only the Supreme Court has the power of judicial review to declare an act of Congress unconstitutional. So John Marshall, as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, helped to strengthen the judicial branch by asserting the doctrine of judicial review of congressional legislation. Soon after this monumental or landmark case that went before the Supreme Court, Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans will attempt to impeach and convict Supreme Court Justice Samuel Chase, an ardent Federalist who was more guilty of a loud mouth than high crimes and misdemeanors. And with their failed attempt to impeach and convict the Supreme Court Justice, judicial independence and the separation of powers had been preserved. When it came to the military, Thomas Jefferson distrusted large standing armies because they could be used to establish a dictatorship, so he will cut the U.S. Army to 2,500 men. Jefferson saw navies as less dangerous than armies because they could not march inland and endanger liberties. But Thomas Jefferson's first major foreign policy decision will soon be made when he will send a naval squadron to the Mediterranean after the Pasha of Tripoli declared war on the United States. Basically, the European powers had decided it was much easier to pay ransom to the states of North Africa, called the Barbary states, than to go to war with them. But when the Pasha of Tripoli did not like his cut from the ransom, he will declare war on the United States. And as a result of this, Thomas Jefferson will cease his opposition to the expansion of Navy. He will send not only the Navy, but the U.S. Marines to the shores of Tripoli. And then eventually the Tripoli War will end in a peace treaty with 1805. So Jefferson was forced to reverse his strong opposition to substantial military forces because of the plunder and blackmailing of American shipping by North African Barbary states. As a result of this Tripolitan War, Jefferson will get Congress to approve the construction of 200 tiny gunboats to protect the coastal waters of the United States. But things in the Trans-Appalachian West are becoming to a boiling point. What happened is that Napoleon, who is now the ruler and emperor of Egypt, has basically persuaded Spain to give over to the French all of the Louisiana Purchase, as well as the port of New Orleans and Louisiana itself. So Thomas Jefferson will send 2 envoys to France in 1803 with the essential goal of purchasing New Orleans and all of the surrounding territory in Louisiana as much as $10 million will buy to secure that port as a right of deposit for American shippers. So they were only sent to buy New Orleans and the immediate vicinity, so to keep the mouth of the Mississippi out of French hands and open to U.S. shipping. But if this basically did not occur, or they failed, Monroe and Livingston, in acquiring the port of New Orleans and all of the surrounding territory of Louisiana, Jefferson decided that the only way to basically keep the French from controlling the Mississippi was to make an alliance with the country's old enemy, Britain. But Napoleon will soon choose in 1803 to sell Louisiana because of the misfortunes and setbacks he has suffered in the Caribbean, in Santo Domingo, which is also known as Haiti, where he sent 25,000 troops led by one of his brother-in-laws as generals to basically regain Haiti and put it under French control. Toussaint Louverture had been a former slave who will lead a slave rebellion and will help win Haitian independence temporarily. The reason why the French troops had failed in their reconquest of Santo Domingo or Haiti was that yellow fever will decimate their numbers. So as a result of his failure in Santo Domingo in creating a French empire in the New World, or in the Western Hemisphere, he basically decided to sell Louisiana to the United States, and Jefferson, hoping that the territory would one day help the United States thwart or block the ambitions of the British, and did not want to drive the United States into the arms of the British, which had been Jefferson's intention if his diplomats Monroe and Livingston had failed in gaining control of New Orleans and the surrounding territory. Concerning the Louisiana Purchase, senators will quickly approve the purchase. It will have enthusiastic public support, and it will be one of the best real estate bargains in history, adding 828,000 square miles to the United States at 3 cents an acre. In other words, a cost of $1,500 million. But again, as president, Jefferson will have to go against what had been his view of the Constitution, in that he will no longer be a strict constructionist of the United States, and he is very conscience-stricken about the purchase of the Louisiana Territory, because he believed that the purchase was unconstitutional. But his advisors and others in the Senate will basically convince him that the United States had the power to acquire new territory under the foreign treaty provisions given to the U.S. Senate in the U.S. Constitution. And the great advantage gained by the United States in the Louisiana Purchase is that it will guarantee U.S. control of the Mississippi River, and there will be no question about whether the United States and its population will have access and control of that river. In 1804, Jefferson will send his personal envoy, Meriwether Lewis, on an expedition of discovery, along with an army officer, William Clark. Lewis and Clark's Army of Discovery, or Corps of Discovery, will go up the Missouri River and spend the first winter in a Mandan village at the headwaters of the Missouri River. When they reach there, they will find an abandoned village, many abandoned villages, because smallpox epidemics have preceded them. So Lewis and Clark's expedition, which will last 2 years, and will go all the way to the Pacific coast of present-day Oregon, will do four things. It will yield a rich harvest of scientific observations, geographical knowledge of the previously unknown region, a plausible American claim to the Oregon region, because if you look at the map closely, the Oregon country was not part of the Louisiana Purchase, but now with their crossing the Oregon country and spending a winter on the Pacific coast, now the United States has a legitimate claim to the region. And also, Lewis and Clark's expedition will open the West to future exploration and trade. They will be led by a Shoshone woman, the wife of a French trapper named Sacagawea. And Lewis and Clark will demonstrate the viability of an overland trail to the Pacific. And they will return in triumph in 1806. But things will get bad for the United States, because now, after a few years of armistice, Napoleon and France will go back to war against the British, and the United States is caught in the middle. The British will begin impressing American sailors into the British Navy, when they will stop and seize sailors from American ships, because they basically argued that they were deserters of the British Navy and they were desperate for sailors for their British Navy in their war against the French. And off the coast of Virginia, a British frigate will attack the Chesapeake when the Chesapeake's captain refuses to give up four supposed deserters of the British Navy, and this will basically cause an incident between the United States and Britain. What happens is in 1806, in 1805, off the southern coast of Spain, the British will gain control of the seas in the Battle of Trafalgar, while in Europe, Napoleon will gain dominance of the continent in the Battle of Austerlitz. So now each one cannot directly attack and harm the other, so the United States will become caught in the middle when the British will issue a series of orders in council, which basically said that all European ports under French control were closed to foreign shipping, including Americans, unless these vessels first stopped at a British port. In retaliation, Napoleon struck back, ordering the seizure of all merchant ships, including Americans, that entered British ports. So to deal with British and French violations of U.S. neutrality, Jefferson will hastily enact the Embargo Act of 1807. Ways in which Americans responded to Jefferson's embargo were the Federalist Party will gain new converts and was revived as a political opponent to the Democratic Republicans. New England will threaten to secede from the United States. People will compare Jefferson to King George III, whom Jefferson had attacked in the Declaration of Independence, and Americans will engage in an illicit trade at the Canadian border. Jefferson's Embargo Act of 1807 basically prohibited all foreign trade. Jefferson's embargo failed for four reasons. One, he underestimated the determination of the British. Britain, for once, produced a bumper grain crops in that year and in the subsequent years that followed. Latin America, that had thrown off Spanish and Portuguese rule, will open its ports for commerce to foreigners, especially the British. And Jefferson overestimated both belligerents' dependence on American trade. He thought that both the French and the British would soon capitulate because they were completely dependent on American trade, but he was wrong. And more importantly, because he had kept the Navy at a minimum size, he miscalculated the difficulty of enforcing it. But one unintended domestic consequence of Jefferson's embargo was to encourage domestic manufacturing in New England. The embargo of Jefferson was replaced in 1809 by the Non-Intercourse Act prohibiting trade with Britain and France only. So in other words, Americans could trade with any country in the world except two, Britain and France. And as a result of the failure of the Embargo Act of 1807, Jefferson will basically end his second term as president with a black eye. Although extremely unpopular, Jefferson's policy of economic coercion did keep the U.S. out of the war. It will stimulate manufacturing in the United States, specifically New England, and it will eventually lead the British to repeal their harsh orders in council. James Madison, who had been Jefferson's choice to succeed him when he takes office, Congress will pass the Macon's Bill number 2. Macon's Bill number 2 permitted trade with all nations, but promised that if either Britain or France lifted its commercial restrictions on U.S. trade, the United States would stop trading with the other by raising an embargo against that non-compliant country. Napoleon will basically manipulate Madison into raising an embargo against Britain because he promises to end his restrictions on American trade when he had no intention of allowing the Americans to trade freely with the British. So supposed French compliance with Macon's Bill number 2 forced Madison to declare a policy of non-importation aimed at Britain and will cause the two countries to drift towards war. So James Madison made a major foreign policy mistake when he was duped into accepting Napoleon's promise to recognize U.S. rights and end commercial restrictions on U.S. trade, in which he had no intention to do so. But by 1810, the most insistent demand for a declaration of war against Britain came from the West and the Old Southwest. A crucial foreign goal for many war hawks in the War of 1812 was to capture and annex Canada as well as Florida. Also, they believed that the British were arming and inciting the Native Americans of the Old Northwest to basically attack Western settlers to basically halt Western expansion westward. So the Warhawks demanded war with Britain because they wanted to wipe out renewed Indian resistance, defend American rights on the high seas, revenge the manhandling of U.S. sailors when it came to British impressment, and to gain more territory like Canada and Florida. So arguments put forth by the Warhawks, who are congressmen from the West and the South, Old Southwest, as a justification for a declaration of war against Britain included: the British armed and incited Indians to attack and raid frontier settlements. British impressment policies were an affront to American nationalism and sovereignty. British Canada and Spanish Florida were attractive and easily obtainable prizes of war, and the orders in council stopped the flow of Western farm products to Western Europe. Also at the same time, Native Americans in the West, led by Tecumseh and his brother Prophet Tenskwatawa, will form a pan-Indian military alliance or confederacy that will be established or form to stop all white expansion. And Tecumseh argued that Indians should not cede control of land to whites unless all of the Native American groups agreed to. They also urged American Indians to resist white ways and revive their own traditional culture and stop their obsession and purchase of European manufactured goods, including metal goods and clothing. This will lead to the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1819, when William Henry Harrison will lead a U.S. military force into the village where the prophet and some few hundred Native American braves were situated. Tecumseh was off recruiting other Native American groups to his pan-Indian military alliance against the whites, and it will be it will result in the death of the dream of a pan-Indian confederacy led by Tecumseh and his brother Prophet. In 1812, Madison turned to war to restore confidence in the Republican experiment by fighting against British disrespect for U.S. rights. In other words, his primary goal in asking Congress to declare war against Britain in 1812 was to restore confidence in America's Republican experiment by fighting against British disrespect of U.S. rights. The irony is, seafaring New England, which was the region most affected by the British and French actions on the high seas, opposed the War of 1812 because Northeast Federalists sympathized with England. It resented the Republican sympathy for Napoleon and France, and Federalists opposed the acquisition of Canada and other Western territory because it would result in more agrarian states that would vote Democratic Republican, not Federalists. So during the War of 1812, the New England states lent more money and sent more food to the British Army than to the U.S. Army, and New England governors stubbornly refused to allow their militia to serve outside the boundaries of their own states.